There's very few things I enjoy getting up before 5 o'clock in the morning for, but this is definitely one of them. Today we're talking about the perfect brisket. So the first step to a perfect brisket is buying the perfect brisket. And that means getting some type of Wagyu. I don't think you can go wrong with the Snake River Farms Gold Wagyu. Yes, very expensive, but if you want the perfect brisket, you gotta spend a little extra money to get the perfect brisket. And it really all starts right there. The second tip to getting a perfect brisket is letting it come up to room temperature. And for a 14.5 pound brisket, that's over an hour. So make sure you allow time for that. Oh man, look at that. So the next step to a perfect brisket is the trim. You just want to trim just the right amount. And when you buy a brisket of this quality, of this grade, there's really not a whole lot of trimming you want to do. They're, pretty good at making sure that you have a great trimmed brisket right out of the package. However, any oxidized meat on the edges, which is a brown color, kind of like that right there, you want to go just trim that off. You also want to make sure you about a 1/4 inch of fat on the fat cap. And then the decal, this big solid chunk of fat that's really hard, you just want to trim a little bit of that off. So that's what we're going to do. The next step to a perfect brisket is wood. You have to cook it over a wood-fired grill. Maybe that's a pellet grill for you. Maybe that's the Lone Star smoker like it is going to be for me today. It really doesn't matter as long as it's wood. It's gotta be a nice wood fire. You don't want to cook a brisket in the oven. You don't want to cook a brisket on any other, gas grill or anything like that. It's gotta be a wood-based grill. And that can be whatever grill that you have, whatever smoker that you have. Maybe you like a little less smoke on your brisket or your meat. Go with the pellet smoker. If you like a little heavier smoke, you gotta go with like an offset smoker, like this Lone Star smoker or something similar. There's something special about this time of morning. I'm a photographer as well. If you haven't checked out my photography channel, go check that out. I'll put a link to it down in the video description. But there's something really special about, that early morning when the sun's coming up, that sunrise. It's so quiet. It's so peaceful. It's just a wonderful time of morning. It's a perfect time to start a perfect brisket. So while I'm letting the meat come up, have a cup of coffee, let's talk about a couple of things to do with this brisket. I know I can hear you guys already. You don't need to have a Wagyu brisket to have a perfect brisket. I've had some prime briskets that are absolutely amazing, all right? But I can never guarantee a prime is going to turn out amazing. There's just fluctuations in the cooking process. If you want the perfect brisket, like you have to have the perfect brisket for whatever reason. Maybe it's a big family gathering. For me, we're going camping with a whole bunch of friends, big group of people. I want the perfect brisket. You're gonna showcase your cooking skills. You're gonna showcase your barbecue. You're gonna maybe inspire people to get into barbecue. You never know. And so when you need that perfect brisket, I just think you gotta spend the extra money and get that Wagyu brisket. So, as you can see, the Lone Star comes with a top shelf and a bottom shelf. What I'm gonna tell you is it's gonna be hotter because heat rises at the top than it is the bottom. So, in the beginning of the cook, it's pretty important to be that low 225. I'm gonna make sure I stay on the bottom shelf. On the top shelf, I'm gonna go to the top shelf when I wrap the brisket. I'm gonna cook fat cap up. And the reason for that is I want the fat to just kind of fall back into the meat instead of falling down into the smoker. I wanna keep as much of it in the meat as I possibly can. So we're gonna go fat cap up. You see the difference in that smoke? It's so much thinner and not as, dirty. It just makes for a much better flavor on the meat. You don't need to inject a brisket when you spend that much money on such a good quality brisket. You don't need to. It just has plenty of juice, plenty of flavor. It's not gonna dry out. You already did your end, and that was spend the extra money and you got that high-end brisket. And again, this isn't about cooking a brisket anytime you want one. This is when you need that perfect brisket. That showcase of what you're made of. Binders, when you put a binder on whatever it is you're cooking before you put your rub on so you can get the rub to stick. Unnecessary. You saw how moist the surface of that meat was. I didn't dry it off because it's not a steak. I'm not trying to get a sear on it. And that natural moisture, that natural juiciness of the brisket, of the piece of meat itself, is more than enough to help salt, pepper, and a garlic, an SPG rub, which is what I used, stick. And it really doesn't matter if you want to use a different rub. If you bought a really high-end brisket, it's going to be very moist, and you're not going to need to do anything to get your rub to stick. When I picked that brisket up, I don't think anything fell off. And I put a lot of salt, pepper, and garlic on that thing. So those are the two main things that I want to address before we get down into the comments and see, well, you didn't inject it. You're going to inject it if you spent the extra money on that brisket and you got a high-end brisket. You don't need that stuff. Save your time, sit back, drink some coffee if it's early in the morning, drink some beer if it's in the afternoon, but just don't worry about it. Let the brisket do what it does best. So we're exactly 4 hours in, and I went ahead and opened up my inlet vent to get my temps up to 250. Now that we're 4 hours in, I can start moving the cook along just a little bit quicker until I decide to wrap. And when I wrap, I'll go to 275. Let's take a look at this brisket and see what it looks like after 4 hours. Oh boy. Look at that brisket, guys. Oh man. We're exactly 4 hours in, and where I'm going now is I'm going to the color that I want. Everybody's a little different when it comes to color. Some people like a lighter brisket, some people like a darker brisket. I like a nice and dark bark. Luckily my wife does as well. So after you cross that 4 hour mark, that's where most of the smoke has gotten into the meat. Now we're looking to go to color. We're developing that bark. And I can tell you, I'm probably for myself about an hour and a half to 2 hours out from a bark that I'm looking at. And then once I get to that point, once I get to the bark color that I'm looking for, then I can go ahead and wrap this brisket. But my gosh, this thing looks amazing. All right, we're 6 hours in. It's time to go ahead and take a look. That's the color I'm looking for, guys. Nice, healthy bark here. Nice mahogany color, you know, just looks amazing. I got juice just dripping all over this thing. Goodness, that is beautiful. And there we go.
I went ahead and added 16 ounces of beef bone broth, chopped up 1 stick of unsalted butter, and put that all into this pan, covered it with foil, put it back on the smoker at 275 degrees.
Guys, we are, oh man, almost 8 hours in, and now's the most crucial time. Temperatures are above 190, so it's time to start checking for tenderness. And my gosh, that looks good. This is by far one of the most crucial steps in getting the perfect brisket, and that is, when do you pull it off the smoker? It's not a temperature thing. I can tell you right now it's not ready though, because I just stuck it in there and I got some resistance, and that's in the point. That's about 190. Resistance is there. Looking at 188 or so. Now see this right here, that's like room temperature butter. That's done. Little resistance there, 188. Little resistance there, 190. Closer to room temperature butter, and you can see that we're closer to 200. Now see, that's about 200, but it's still got resistance in it, and that's in the flat. So we're not done yet, but we're getting real close. And so I'm starting to get some rain, that figures. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull this brisket as soon as I get that tenderness. When I slide that probe in and over the entire brisket, and it's somewhere around 200, 202, 203 degrees. When that probe goes in, like room temperature butter, like I'm sticking it in room temperature butter, that is the absolute necessity when it comes to getting the perfect brisket. And the balance is, if you go past that, it's gonna start drying out. You gotta pull it exactly when you get that consistency of room temperature butter. And that's what I'm gonna do. I'm estimating about another half an hour, 45 minutes or so, because it's a pretty big brisket. So just a little fire management tip for you guys. As you're approaching the end of a cook, if you're using an offset smoker, don't fall into the trap of thinking you probably have enough wood on the fire. You don't want to waste another log or two. Put the extra log or two on, okay? Because the last thing you want to do is get to the end of a cook with a brisket and have your heat die off, and you know it's going from 275 and it dies back to 200, and you're trying to push through it. You don't want to do that. I've done that in the past, and you know, you learn your lesson with that pretty quickly. And I just want to throw that tip out there. It's not necessarily how to get the best brisket, but proper fire management is really important if you do want to get the best brisket on an offset. Alright guys, if you remember right, I just took the very tip off of this corner right here, and that aligned me with where I need to cut my slices perfectly with how the grain runs through the brisket. So this brisket was an absolute just amazing cook. It went perfectly, and the step that I just completed that is one of the most important is letting it rest for about, I let this one rest for 2.5 hours, and I would recommend at least an hour and a half. And where I let it rest is I just put it in my oven with the oven off, door closed, and let it sit there for 2.5 hours. And you gotta let it rest. You just do. All meat needs to rest after you cook it, but a brisket is just, it needs that time for the juices to just kind of distribute back into the meat. Make sure you let your meat rest, guys. Let's slice into this thing. Oh, you know that's a good sign. Oh, it's falling apart. The flat is usually the driest part of the brisket, but I can tell you right now, that's got a lot of moisture in it, and it is very tender. All right, now's a good time. Once you get into the brisket a little good time for the bend test. It doesn't get any more tender than that. Look at that, it's just absolutely, just so tender. All right, so when you're slicing your brisket and you get about, well, every brisket's different. In this case, we're about 2/3 of the way into the brisket. And this layer right here that you see, that's where the point and actually the point is on the bottom here, and the flat, which is on top, come together, and that fat layer just kind of separates them. And that, I mean, it's the most juiciest part of the brisket here when you have these two coming together. But what you want to do is you want to change the direction that you're slicing, because you always want to slice across the grain. But the grain has changed now that the point has come into the picture. So we're going to turn it and cut it right in half. And now what we can do is slice it this way, or you can cut, you can cut it into cubes for burnt ends. A lot of people like to do that. I love burnt ends. And there you go. I mean, look at that. Let's see how this perfect brisket tastes. Oh my gosh.